here on TalkTV, we are joined by Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, who is ready to talk to us about this issue. Fleur, we've seen this apology by the IDF. They've obviously had a thorough investigation into how these 7 aid workers were killed. They've called it a grave mistake, and in fact, the brigade commander in the IDF has been dismissed from his post. Do you think this apology goes far enough for the international community?
Well, it seems that the international community has standards for Israel that they don't seem to apply to anybody else. This is a terrible tragedy. It was a mistake. They obviously had the wrong intelligence. It's very regretful. I want to remind everyone that there's unfortunately one of the casualties of war is friendly fire. We had our own tragedy a few months ago when 3 hostages, just when we thought they could have been rescued, were thought of by the army as terrorists, and they were killed. 3 Israeli hostages. It was a very, very tragic moment also. And it happens in every war. It's happened to the UK, it's happened to the US. But what's different here, and this is what really, really upsets us, is the fact that we're having a debate on whether this was intended, whether this was, something deliberate that the Israeli army did to a convoy of humanitarian workers. And that's what's upsetting. Of course, it was a mistake. It should never have happened. We have to learn our lessons. The army's already putting things in place so this doesn't happen again. But how can people actually believe that this was intentional? Do they believe that when the Americans bombed 2 weddings in Iraq and Afghanistan, that was intentional? Do they believe that when all those innocent people in Libya were killed by UK forces, that was intentional? No, nobody believes that was intentional. They believe it's a horrible, terrible mistake. But Fleur, why in this case are we even arguing about the intent? Why?
Fleur, certainly I'm not arguing about the intent. I don't believe for one moment this is intentional. Are we any closer to the hostages being released? Because obviously that is one of the stated aims, the destruction of Hamas and its senior leadership, but also the hostages being released. Are we any closer to seeing those hostages being released?
Well, this is really the crux of the matter. If we had a deal in place, like we've been trying to do for 2 months, then none of this would be happening. There would be a ceasefire right now. And ultimately, Israel needs to get out those 134 hostages, from a 1-year-old baby to 80-year-old elderly people. And that's really what this is about. And unfortunately, over the last few weeks, it's been Hamas who have been completely intransigent about actually cutting a deal, while at the same time trying to get the whole world to ask for a ceasefire without any conditions. And so we could have a ceasefire right now, this hour, next hour. Just release the hostages. That's what it's about right now.
But following that call between President Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, President Biden has called for an immediate ceasefire. Are people concerned in Israel about this sort of language coming out of the United States?
Well, I think that to ask for a ceasefire without it being conditional on the hostages is simply ridiculous. What country would agree to something like that? So any ceasefire has to be linked to the freedom of those hostages, who, by the way, Biden actually committed to working towards freeing the hostages. 7 of them are American citizens. And so to ask for a ceasefire without Israel giving anything back seems ludicrous. And for Israel, what are we going to be getting out of it if we can't even have our innocent hostages home?
Yeah, no, you're right to focus on those hostages coming home. But so you think President Biden's comments are ludicrous then when he's called for an immediate ceasefire?
Well, look, I understand that he wants to calm things down, but he also made a commitment to many of those families of the hostages that he would do everything in his power to bring them home. And so at the moment, if he's asking for a ceasefire without making that conditional, without putting pressure on Qatar. Now, let me remind everyone, Qatar has got very heavy interest with the Americans. They've got a military base in Qatar, with Britain. How much investment of Qatar goes into the Football League or anybody else? If people were focusing their pressure on Qatar and on Hamas and not Israel, maybe the hostages would already have been home.
Okay, well, let me ask you, there's been a response from the Israeli government. The government has opened the port in Ashdod and the Erez land crossing to enable humanitarian aid to go into Gaza. We learned this week international community said that Gaza is on the cusp of a famine. Will opening those humanitarian aid corridors be enough to stop famine taking hold in Gaza?
Well, I'll say a few things. I'm not sure because I believe that the problem is actually with the distribution rather than with the aid going in. There's hundreds of tons of aid going in.
But Fleur, there were previously, sorry, just to pick up on that, there were previously thousands of tons going in a day. It has been reduced by tenfold, and people would say that is the reason that Gaza is on the brink of famine. Is opening those routes up enough to avert that humanitarian catastrophe of famine in Gaza?
Well, what I wanted to say is that the main problem, I believe, is with distribution, because a lot of these humanitarian organizations are not being able to get the distribution, the aid to the people. And part of the problem is that Hamas, the terrorists, is stealing, we believe, 60 to 70% of the aid. And we've seen videos in the last 2 weeks of the open market in Gaza selling a part of the aid that is supposed to go to the needy people. So something's off here. Something's not working in terms of getting the aid to the people who actually need the aid. And also, let's be honest, I've been hearing that we've been in the brink of famine for weeks. We heard back in October, November, that they had 2 weeks left of petrol and 2 weeks left of electricity. I think that there's a lot of hyperbole going on here. I'm not sure what the state of the situation is, but all I can tell you is that I believe there's enough aid going in. Now we've opened up new routes, more aid is going in. Let's see if in a week we're still talking about the brink of a famine.
Who do you think is pushing, if it's not true then, who do you think is pushing that narrative that Gaza is on the brink of a famine, and why?
Well, the mouthpiece of Hamas and Iran is Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera are very dishonest brokers. They've already apologized, which is a miracle in itself, for a story about Israeli soldiers raping Palestinian women, which is completely false, nothing true to it. And then they retracted it 2 weeks ago. They are essentially the mouthpiece of the Islamists, not just here, all over the world.
Fleur, but
and everybody seems to be getting their stories from them.
Fleur, it's the UN has also highlighted the fact that Gaza is on the brink of famine. Is the UN the mouthpiece of Hamas and Islamists?
Well, unfortunately, UNRWA in Gaza has been proven to have a good chunk of their workers as members of Hamas. 15 of them took part in the October 7th massacre. So are we really to believe them?
Okay. Fleur, last question. Do you think we'll see elections in Israel this year? Can this cabinet and war government hold? And if so, when will those elections be?
That's, I'm not a prophet. What I will say is that I believe we should have elections after a war. And so the question is, when does the war end? When do the aims of this war make this the end of this war? And are we going to have another war with Hezbollah in the north anytime soon, which will extend? I do believe that we need elections, but I don't believe it's a good idea to have elections in the middle of a war. It's just, I don't even know how the logistics of that would work. I would say, hopefully, if we don't have a war with the North and we can wrap this up in the next few months, maybe by end of 2024, we'd be seeing an election, but it's really too early to tell at the moment.